Hey everyone, in this video, I'm going to tell you my top 5 Christian books that I read in 2022. Hi everyone, and welcome to Book Talks with Miss Thomas. If you're new here, please subscribe. And if you're returning, thanks so much for joining me. Welcome back. On this channel, I talk about the great books that I've read, and I do have very diverse taste in books. Sometimes I talk about Christian books, sometimes I talk about secular books. But in this video, I want to highlight Christian books. There were some very good Christian books. There were lots of very good Christian books that I read in 2022, but I narrowed it down to 5. And if you've watched my channel for a while, you know that my favorite book of the year was Fragments of Fear by Carrie Stuart Parks. And I actually, after that book, there was a letter from the author that said, I hope you enjoyed my book. And it had an email address. So I emailed her and told her how much I enjoyed her book. And she wrote me back, which was really exciting. So Fragments of Fear, it was sort of like a Hitchcock movie to me. It was the story of this woman who was an artist, and she is at the funeral of her fiance when this other woman says that she's engaged to the guy. So that's a little weird right there. And then the day of the funeral, someone from the pound or an animal control place calls her and says they have her dog. The problem is she doesn't have a dog. So she tries to explain to them that she doesn't have a dog, and they're adamant that, the dog was microchipped and this is your dog. So she goes to look into it and find out that it is the dog of a person that she has painted. You see my shadow? It's kind of bothering me. I'm sorry. But anyway, so she painted this man, and it's his dog. So she tries to return the dog to the man, only to get to his house and discover that he's been very brutally murdered. Now, this book does not go into graphic detail. I'm not one for graphic gore or violence or any kind of victimization in great detail. That bothers me. So this book does not go into too much detail, but definitely explains and describes somewhat that there's been a brutal murder. So she can't return the dog to the man because he's just been killed. So she flees the scene of the murder and tries to call the police, but then she turns around and goes back to the scene and sees that the police are putting the murdered body in the trunk of the car, and she knows that's not quite right. So the killers are posing as police, and then they spot her and they're hunting her. So she's trying to find who killed this man that she painted, the owner of the dog. She's got the dog throughout the book. And the people who killed the man are also after her now. And I also think it's just, I've read a couple of Carrie Stuart Parks books, and there's usually a lovable dog in the book too. So I really enjoyed Fragments of Fear by Carrie Stuart Parks. Along the same lines, I'm quite the mystery reader. If you are looking for good Christian mysteries, I do recommend other books in this video. But the second Christian mystery that I really enjoyed in 2022 is One Little Lie by Colleen Coble. And that one starts out with this teenage girl. She is in this cult, and she's very pregnant, and she goes into labor when all sorts of chaos breaks out, and her father says, we've got to go now. And he takes her and they leave. And she says, I can't leave without my baby. And he says, the baby died. I think he says the baby died, and they leave and run to safety. Fast forward, now she's an adult and she's a detective, and her father's a police detective as well. He's a retired police detective, and she's a detective, and she's investigating all of these murders when this man and his teenage boy show up, and they're very interested in her for some reason. So there was a lot in that book. It was about the woman trying to come to terms with her past and the crimes that she's investigating as a police detective, and the man with his son. That was really I love that aspect of the book too, about, the father and his teenage son trying to have a relationship with one another. So One Little Lie, and that's the first in a series of 3, I believe. And I really enjoyed that one. The Reckoning at Gossamer Pond is what set my whole Philippians 4 project in motion. I went to a Scholastic book fair for a Christian library, and I realized there aren't enough Christian books that are engaging for young people. And so I started researching that, and one of the first Christian books that I read was The Reckoning at Gossamer Pond by Jamie Jo Wright, and I really enjoyed that book. That was a story of a girl. It had a dual timeline, and there was in the timeline that I was most interested in was, the more modern one. There's this girl, and she moves into this house. I think it was her childhood home. And right next door is this boyfriend that she had when she was a teenager. And I don't think it's a spoiler to say, well, maybe it is a spoiler. She and the teenager were in love, and he abandoned her when she really needed him to be there for her. I'll say that much. And so the two of them, they have reason to be uncomfortable around each other because now they're adults. And so they have to try and move forward as neighbors. And that was one aspect of the plot. And then there's this past timeline where these people, same area, same neighborhood, but it's many, many, many years before. And these two brothers are traveling evangelists, and they're having, the tent in the center of town kind of revival. And they're controversial because I guess the one preaches rather harshly. And he's a little creepy, and so there's sort of this creepy thing about these two brothers that go around preaching in the town. And there's this woman that the one brother seems awfully interested in, and she's uncomfortable around him. And it's just, there's a lot of wonderful characters in The Reckoning of Gossamer Pond, and the dual timelines, and the whole idea of the evangelism and people coming, at night for a revival. I thought that was such a refreshing thing to see in a book. I really enjoyed The Reckoning at Gossamer Pond. The Librarian of Boone's Hollow was another one that I really loved. And that already has a sequel, which I have not yet had the opportunity to read. But The Librarian at Boone's Hollow is historical fiction. It's about a girl who, she's in college when the stock market crash occurs, and her family can no longer afford college. And so she goes to become a librarian, and she goes out on horseback delivering books to people in this community who want nothing to do with her because she's an outsider, and because she ends up renting a room from this woman who's also an outsider. And then the people that she delivers the books with, there's 2 girls, and one of them was just horrible to her, really didn't like her because she was an outsider. And also the girl has a crush on the guy who works with them. And of course, the guy who works with them likes the main character that everyone else hates. So I'm not doing that book justice, though. It was a wonderful book. I loved the characters. I especially loved the librarian at Boone's Hollow because she just could not be because she just would not be stifled. She really, she wanted to just go out there and contribute to the world, whether it be creating a scrapbook with recipes from rejected magazines or delivering books to different people, even people who wanted nothing to do with her. She was just a fantastic character. And the way that she had to forge relationships with these people, I really enjoyed that. I enjoy books where people have to relate to one another and work together despite their differences. And I loved The Librarian at Boone's Hollow. The last book that I'm going to tell you I read in 2022 that I recommend as a Christian book, I don't know if the genre of this particular book is labeled as Christian, but I thought it was a lovely Christian book. It was called Emily of Deep Valley, and it was the story of this girl, also like Librarian of Boone's Hollow, I guess. They were similar in that Emily of Deep Valley graduates from high school in about the 1950s, very early. I believe it was coming after World War II, but she graduates from high school, and all of her friends, male and female, go off to college. And she does not go off to college because she's raised by her grandfather, and her grandfather's up there in years. And she doesn't want to leave him behind, and somebody has to stay and look after him. So she stays behind and looks after her grandfather. And it talks a lot about her loneliness and her trying to, create an identity for herself, having graduated from high school as someone who loved school and was very academic, but could not go off to college. And she ends up finding a way to put her mind to good use because she encounters these immigrants, and they struggle with the English language. They live in her community, but English is not their first language. And so she starts teaching them how to learn the English language, and she ends up building a community and tries to have a class for them. And it was just a lovely, heartwarming story about a girl building a life for herself. And I loved the storyline of the people who had immigrated to her community that were trying to learn the language and trying to build their own community and find acceptance among their neighbors. And that was a book that I really enjoyed. I don't know that it's put out there as Christian, but it was truly a lovely book. And while God may not have been directly mentioned in the book, he was definitely present throughout the themes of the story. And it was definitely a clean book. So those are my 5 books that I recommend from the Christian genre that I read in 2022.